All right, folks, another edition of Cape Ann Today. Heather and I have two interviews to share with you. Our first is with Mary Parks. She is from greencrab.org, and she gives us the A to Z on green crabs and how you can prepare them to eat. So what does green crab taste like? Take it away, Mary.
Essentially, what our organization does is we work to specifically develop culinary markets for the invasive green crab. And green crabs are a huge issue here in Massachusetts. They target some of our most vulnerable and valuable fisheries, and they also destroy super valuable eelgrass habitat, which is the nursery habitat for a lot of the finfish species we like to eat, as well as vulnerable migratory birds, turtles, and a bunch of other species. So what we do specifically on the culinary side is a couple things. We partner with chefs to get more people cooking with green crabs, to publish free recipes on our website, to provide online tutorials, as well as we're hosting a lot of webinars and cooking workshops that I'll mention a little bit coming up. And we also work with the supply chain side. So partnering with wholesalers and fishermen in order to make green crabs available to the general public. That being said, we have an initiative this summer, which is called our Shuck at Home effort. And that began with delivering 650 pounds of green crabs directly to people in the greater Boston area. And in collaboration with that, we provided a lot of recipes and resources. We have shucking school episodes that are going to be coming out every 2 weeks, going over the many ways in which you can shuck and prepare green crabs. And part of that is also going to look at how we can expand that effort and partner with local wholesalers that will be donating, working with the shellfish broker to provide those wholesalers with free green crabs, so that they're then able to distribute those green crabs to their local networks of chefs. And so part of this is understanding, what can we work on and what feedback can we get in terms of what's difficult for people working in their home kitchens for cooking with green crabs. What do chefs need in terms of volume and processing? And also, how can we get that feedback from wholesalers as well? So what's challenging on their ends? What is pricing going to look like on their ends? And what are really some of the holdbacks into getting green crabs out onto the culinary market? And why we think the culinary market is so important is because there are existing markets for green crabs in the bait market. However, fishermen just aren't being paid the same amount. And with 40 to 60 cents to pretty low numbers per pound that fishermen are being paid, wholesalers are also not necessarily seeing that as a valuable resource. And so as an organization, our hope is that through developing culinary markets, we can get more wholesalers excited, we can get more fishermen fishing them, and we can begin to mitigate their invasive impact.
So I would like to start with just who's extracting them out of the marshes? Let's start there. How many fishermen do you have working on that, and what does that look like?
So right now we're primarily working with the shellfish broker in Chatham, Massachusetts, Jamie Bassett, and he's going to be purchasing green crabs from other folks, I think, in the upcoming months. However, in terms of Ipswich and in terms of the Great Marsh, we spoke with Scott LaPrest a few weeks back as part of our Green Crabs in the Great Marsh Q&A that we did with filmmaker Nubar Alexanian. And he said that numbers are pretty consistently up this year, that Ipswich did have a pretty normal season in terms of green crabs, and people are fishing green crabs. However, from the wholesaler end, I know that some of the wholesalers I've talked to have had a hard time pulling up to some of the landings in Ipswich and being able to actually purchase green crabs, that some people are trying to focus on some more lucrative options, such as, digging for shellfish or lobstering. And so I think that with the pandemic, that's certainly narrowed the seafood market. However, I know that there are still quite a few folks participating in the bounty program, according to Scott. And we do have more information about that in our recorded Q&A that Scott talks over, like some of the landings, historic and whatnot, that you can find on our blog on greencrab.org as well.
Now, the bounty program, is that still a state-funded program where they're paying for fishermen to
It is, yes.
green?
Yes. And it's been an incredible program. So essentially, for example, in Ipswich, what it allows is that fishermen who are removing green crabs from the water are paid 40 cents per pound. And a lot of those times, those green crabs are just being composted or disposed of. That being said, a lot of the times they are being sold on the bait market. They are being sold to people who are interested in trying out green crabs. But I think the key issue that a lot of the times we're seeing is that even though people are fishing green crabs, the processing is different for culinary purposes. And so having fishermen understand how to store them and how to have them go through HACCP certified channels so that people can safely eat them and so the wholesalers trust the product is really important.
Yeah, and actually, I was just going to ask, what do they taste like? And has it been a hard sell for seafood markets, wholesalers, chefs, and why?
I think that to answer your second question first, that it has been an initial learning curve. And that if you prime people with understanding that these aren't exactly like the classic big crabs like blue crab and Dungeness crab and king crab that people are working with, and that preparing them is different, that they're a lot more open to it. They're not a lot more willing to learn the shucking techniques. And I think it's the same for chefs. And if you essentially provide some of that information ahead of time and also work with chefs who are used to working with smaller crabs, there hasn't been as much as a learning curve. Some of the preparation methods that you can work with for green crabs are everything from putting them in stocks and broths, to shucking them for green crab roe, to shucking them for meat. Something that we've been working with more and more has been how do we actually shuck the crab legs so that you can pop them out and get this delicious little lollipop of meat. They taste pretty sweet. They don't taste very crabby. And we did a survey for that. The results are still pending and we're still getting some information back, but just asking people, like, what did green crabs taste like to you who received some of the free green crab deliveries? And we got sweet, literally quote, not too fishy at all was one of them. I liked them better than blue crabs and not super challenging to work with. And some people were saying like, oh, shucking them for meat was such a headache. But other people were saying, I'm used to working with smaller crabs. This wasn't that much of a challenge to me.
Boy, you think it might be an easy sell eventually just because so many places use imitation crab meat for thing, and this would be less fishy and more abundant. Who knows?
From my experience with green crabs, and maybe they've gotten bigger, Mary, but it was pretty hard to find the meat. And the roe was easy and very interesting to work with, but the meat itself was small and difficult to access.
It is tough. I would not recommend that people who are just diving into green crabs right off the bat start working with the meat. It's certainly a more intensive shucking process. However, for example, if you are taking this technique that we have that we call like the little lollipop of meat, where you take the four legs and push them together, you're actually able to get a pretty good chunk of meat at the end.
Okay.
Another part about that is, and we only know this based on observations and what we've heard and my own experience working with green crabs, but I have found that green crabs in Ipswich and the North Shore tend to be a bit smaller. Whereas some of the ones from Chatham I've been seeing from Jamie Bassett have been everywhere from 4 inches across the carapace, and some of those can be a lot easier to shuck the meat out of. But then again, it really, really, really depends. That being said, the roe that you mentioned is one of my favorite ways to eat green crabs, and we have a couple of recipes that are going to be coming out in the next couple of weeks. A sweet corn salad with green crab roe that we serve in the half shell. We're all going to be demoing that with the Maria Mitchell Foundation and Nantucket Land Council, as well as some simple soup recipes like a green crab bisque topped with crab legs, and you can put a little roe in there as well. We're also going to be doing a cooking workshop with that coming up at the end of this week with the Sustainable Business Network.
I thought, in my experience, the broth was amazing. It really made a particularly delicious and worthy to work with broth. So that was really good.
Yeah.
Mary, any other work being done on the soft shells?
So I know that this season for a couple people involved on the soft shell side was a little bit tough just because, again, fishermen are worried about being able to make ends meet. That being said, I know that there are a couple folks who are hoping to get a couple of soft shell molting projects in at the end of the summer and building up for next year.
Good, because that's, do you want to tell the connection there with Venice, how it's such a delicacy in Venice?
Yeah, so in Venice, green crabs are a native species, and essentially there is a pretty established industry in Venice for molting soft-shell green crabs. They're known as molecche in Venetian or molecche in Italian. They are absolutely delicious. They're a little bit smaller, again, than a soft-shell blue crab, but they're a bit sweeter. And I would say about 7 of them to even as few as 3 of their larger crab make a great meal. And they're absolutely fantastic to eat. Last year with Green Crab R&D project, there was a lot of work to promote and develop the soft shell market. And I know a lot of chefs in the area are really, really eager to get their hands on some soft shells. And so once the fishermen, at least within greencrab.org's network, are able to get back into producing soft shells, I know there will be a demand for them.
And as I recall, they demand a pretty high price in Venice. So it's a worthy project if we could get it to happen, right?
80 euros a kilo. And so when we look at those prices in comparison to 40 cents a pound, which, you know, fishermen are often making, it's a huge, huge price difference. That being said, in Venice, they also work with and prepare green crab roe, which is known as massanette. And it's actually a term for the roe connected to the meat in the top of the shell and the bottom of the shell. And there's so many delicious recipes that you can also make with the roe. We're hoping to, working with some Venetian fishermen that we're working with now, get some more classic Venetian recipes out there. However, that being said, we're also trying to build up some American style recipes with green crab. One of the past ones that Green Crab R&D project created was, and I know you worked on a lot as well, was the she crab soup, which is one of my favorite ways to eat green crabs. And it's, instead of the roe and meat of the blue crab, you can do that with green crab roe and meat. It's a sweet, delicious, super tasty New England spin on a Charleston classic.
Yeah, and the hope was that because it's illegal, I believe, to harvest the blue crab roe, this could be a new substitute for the she crab soup that is so popular in the South. Yeah.
And I think that with a lot of chefs in at least the greater Boston area and New York City, which is kind of the 2 culinary hubs that we work with, there's been a lot of excitement about the roe. People are familiar with lobster roe a lot of the times, blue crab roe. And I've heard from a lot of chefs as well that we are entering a time when people are asking more questions about their seafood. They're willing to try more, and palates are really expanding. And so I really hope to see a lot more roe dishes in restaurants, not only because it's a super easy and delicious way to cook with green crabs, but when we look at the fact that a single green crab can produce almost 200,000 eggs per year, the act of removing those female crabs from the environment before they release all of those eggs can do a lot in terms of potentially mitigating them. And so it's a great way to incentivize people to eat delicious crab caviar.
Right. Eat the next generation.
Yeah.
Corey, any last questions?
Yeah, Mary, if people want to learn more about greencrab.org, how can they do that?
Yeah, so if you head over to greencrab.org, our website, then you'll find a bunch of recipes and resources. We also have a page that goes over all of our Shuck at Home activities. We're going to be coming out with a beach guide for kids. We're hosting 2 free cooking workshops that are coming up. You'll find our interview with Newbar there. a bunch of recipes, and also signups for a free green crab pickup program that we're trying to organize right now.
You know, Corey, so much of this Can We Eat Green Crabs story began a bunch of years ago. Actually, it was the fall before the winter of 2015. And Roger Warner and I took a big bucket of green crabs to Legal Seafood, to the executive chef at Legal Seafood. And we said, you guys need to make broth out of these in a commercial way because they're great and you will save the fish if you do that. And that guy, to his credit, he said, okay, right in front of us. He did a little mirepoix and made up a batch of green crabs. Loved the taste. He said, we're on, we're going to do it. But
Really?
what happened was, yeah, but that winter was the worst winter ever. And the next spring, when they wanted to harvest all those green crabs, they actually did get impacted by the cold winter, and there weren't many. And then the program died.
Well,
So
they're back.
yeah, well, Roger Berkowitz, Legal Seafood, we need you back.
Yeah, very cool. That was a great story. Mary was awesome to talk to. All right, now we have another special chat. This is with Madi Hayes. She's a grad student from where, Heather?
Quinnipiac.
Oh, yeah, right.
University, yeah.
And she did a documentary called Bread for a Pandemic about the phenomenon of how people were baking during the COVID crisis, especially when it first hit, as just sort of a primal remedy dealing with what became the new normal. So very cool stuff there. You want to chat about this a little bit before we play it?
Yeah, I'm still like really pleased to have an answer to what I kept wondering about during this pandemic. You and I were way too busy working for me to start baking. But if we hadn't been doing this, I probably would have been doing all that baking too. And I kept watching people online saying, this is bigger than just afternoon chocolate chip cookie baking. This is answering a need. And I really would like to know what's going on. And Madi answers that.
She does. Okay, so this is Madi Hayes now, and we're going to show the interview, and then that's going to be followed by her short documentary called Bread for a Pandemic.
I knew that I knew that a lot of people were baking during the pandemic, and at first I thought that it was just kind of a way, like a distraction, like a time filler, because people were at home and they had less stuff to do, especially people my age. They weren't working full time. We didn't have classes to go to necessarily. So I just thought it was kind of like a time filler. And then the more that I researched it online for this documentary, I kind of realized that it goes like far beyond just distraction. And it was kind of satisfying this theory that I researched a little bit. And it was called like the self-determination theory, which basically just means that every single person needs autonomy, mastery, and belonging to feel happy or satisfied. And especially in times of kind of uncertainty or complicated times, people hold on to activities where they kind of have like concrete, tangible results, which kind of makes sense. Like people want something rewarding, even though there's not really a whole lot going on. So it kind of makes sense why people were baking and gardening and even exercising. They just wanted to have something to kind of prove that they were still making progress, even though, the whole world was kind of put to a halt in a sense. So that kind of interested me when I was first starting out. And that's kind of how I just kind of interviewed different friends that I had, family members who I knew were baking. And it was just kind of interesting how it was like all different ages. Everyone was like, okay, we're just going to bake. And even if we've never done it before, we're just going to try it out. And we have all this time. So if we fail, then we just keep doing it. And that's why like all the sales for all the products and everything just kind of were flying off the shelves and everything.
Yeah, it was pretty early on when I began to see all these posts about no one could get yeast. And I was like, wow, what's going on? That's very odd, because I actually wasn't baking, and but I have baked a lot in the past. And I thought there's something happening here that I'm not understanding. So so do you want to talk about that more, about the people you interviewed and what they were baking and how they were feeling about it?
Yeah, so the people that I talked to kind of had a little bit of baking experience in the past, so it kind of made sense that they would just continue that. But the people that I talked to were some of my close friends. I think there was one friend who made cinnamon rolls, which they just looked great. That was like one of the favorite videos that I got. And she kind of just, I think, she was already very interested in food. She's kind of like a foodie, if you will. So she was like definitely already interested in that. So talking to her was interesting because she just kind of, she had a passion for baking to begin with. But some of the other people that I talked to, like my aunt, for example, she also sent in a video, and she kind of dedicated like a portion of her week, basically. Like every Friday they would have hamburgers, and so she would make rolls like every single Friday, and it would take up like a whole portion of her day. And it's kind of funny because we have so much time. Like bread does take a long time to make. Sometimes it can be like up to like 4 or 5 hours, we realized. But it's just like simple things that you kind of just like stick to, and then you have, you know, your own bread, like your own product that you made with your own hands. So it was kind of great. But
Corey, do you have a question?
Well, so I was just going to ask what the response was. I mean, you already said things are like there are actually sales happening because of this. So
yeah.
What do you think would be the next step now? Do you just continue this, or because is something going to spur off of this?
Yeah, at first I just thought that this was going to be a fad, like because of the pandemic, but I think people are realizing like the rewards that come with baking and gardening and all of this stuff that is kind of like rewarding just for like your personal like self-fulfillment. So I think it's going to continue even after quarantine is like officially over, or just people are kind of getting back to some kind of normal. I think in a sense it'll still continue because people are realizing from that experience that it's rewarding and it's a sense of comfort, even though, you know, things are kind of not quite as bad as they were in March and April necessarily, but I think it's going to continue past the pandemic, I think.
So is Denise still making hamburger buns?
Yeah, I believe she's definitely still baking. She's kind of just always I think she would always bake before this, but the pandemic just kind of like heightened that. But I think she's still baking every week, basically.
That was one of the things that I also thought was really interesting, that people were taking on obscure recipes. I mean, they were getting pretty, and now hamburger buns are actually pretty obscure. I only know of a few chefs who actually take the trouble to make their hamburger buns anymore. And it's kind of a tricky recipe to get it be soft and fluffy. So any other interesting, like odd baking products that you found amongst your interviews?
Obscure products.
Or results. I should say results.
Results. I know that people were making all kinds of things that I didn't even think of. Like one of my friends made like lemon poppy seed muffins, which kind of just like inspired me. Like I ended up making them myself like a few weeks later. But just like seeing all the different things that people are making, I was like, oh, that's a good idea. Like I'll try that out. Because I think the other part of it too is that people still want like a sense of belonging or like to feel part of a group. And I think baking was kind of a way to kind of, it's almost like like a book club or something like that. Like, oh, we're all just going to bake and then like show each other what we made on social media or through our Zoom meetings or whatever kind of way that we can, just to stay and like communicate with each other.
Yeah, that's another thing. People were showing them off in Zoom meetings, right?
Yeah. So I would either I would have like friends or family send videos in, or I would just have them like Zoom meeting with me and then just kind of like get the video that way. But they were all pretty willing to do it. They were all like, yeah, like we have plenty of time. We'll send you some videos. A lot of the people that I reached out to were like, oh, we're actually baking right now. So we'll just send you some videos or pictures. And so it actually it worked out for me for my documentary because I had all this footage.
And where did you arrive at this self-determination theory? Where did you find that?
So I read an article. I don't remember where I originally saw it, but there was an article in Outside Magazine about kind of like the relationship between kind of the health of it and why people are kind of starting to do all of these activities that are giving them like concrete rewards. Like it talks about baking and gardening and exercising. And all just kind of the stuff that would lead to self-fulfillment during like complicated times or times of uncertainty.
That is so interesting, because I truly was wondering about this. And when your aunt sent me the video, I thought this was the answer I wanted. And the other thing that I had learned very early on was that some of our local restaurants were supplying baking supplies. Did you see that, Corey? Like
I was going to ask about that. Yeah.
Yeah, because the grocery stores were running out of them, and some of the local restaurants were able to, get more volume wholesale. And so, our local coffee shop was announcing that they now had flour and butter and eggs. I was like, all right, this is really, I need to understand what's happening here.
Yeah.
And you can understand like baking cookies on a rainy day, but this was really coming out of someplace, as you're identifying now, as very specific to tough times.
Right. It's like very deep rooted. It's kind of like almost like a primal instinct. Like when someone's kind of, panicking in a sense, like they kind of just reach for these things that they know will give them that they're going to be able to like produce like I said, like something concrete. And so a lot of the research that I saw too, like the very like basic baking ingredients were just like completely sold out. Like I think they said baking powder sales increased like 450% since last year. And for like months on end, you couldn't find flour anywhere. And so actually my aunt also sent us flour from an online store. And so one day we just like opened our door and there was like 3 like huge bags of flour. And she was like, here you go. Now you can bake as much as you want. So everyone's kind of like ordering like bulk baking offline too. It's not even just in stores. But yeah, so seeing that was definitely interesting.
Any theories as to why it is baking and not pickling or stew making or taking on really complicated chicken recipes? Any feelings about that? Why baking is so satisfying here?
I think baking is also seen as kind of like a more simple activity in a sense. Like there's very few ingredients for most breads anyway. Like there are probably some pretty complicated bread recipes, but for the most part, if you're just making like standard bread, you can only really need sometimes like yeast, baking powder, and flour. So I think it just like the simpleness of it is attractive to people. And I think that they think it's manageable, or especially for people who are first starting out or don't know that much about baking, they're like, okay, this is something easy to start off as, and then we can build up from there. I think something like full-on cooking would be too complicated, and I think just kind of like balancing out with like really complicated, uncertain things, and then balancing that with like simple baking recipes, I think is kind of where that came from.
Was there any one bread recipe that everybody was making, or any one cookie recipe?
A lot of chocolate chip cookies, like very, like I said, like very like simple, like classic things. That's what I was getting a lot of. Like there was some more like people who had obviously baked before were making more complicated things, but for the most part, like people who were taking this on for the first time during the pandemic definitely were sticking to like the very basic, just like a loaf of bread or just like very basic muffins. Yeah.
Maddie, I want to know where your love for baking began.
So I actually, before I started this documentary, I didn't know that much about baking myself. My mom is a baker, so she was very interested in it. She made bread while we were stuck at home, but I didn't know that much about it. I just noticed while we were in the pandemic and I had to find some kind of topic, and I didn't know where to start because, making a documentary when everyone's stuck at home and no one's really doing anything, I was like, okay, well, I could make a documentary about the pandemic, but I kind of wanted to focus it on the good things that people are doing, just to kind of, stay motivated or stay happy and fulfilled during this time. And baking was just kind of like the obvious choice because so many people were doing it. It was all over social media. And it just seemed like the perfect kind of topic because it was so relevant and timely. And so I think just from doing that project, I learned a lot more about baking. And even now, we've been baking a lot more. When they're in uncertain times, they just kind of, revert back to these like very simple activities just to like kind of get a sense of control.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, want to feel in control when they have no idea what's going to happen in the next like day, let alone year. So I think it all just kind of goes back to that. So I just found it very interesting because it's kind of like a mix of like psychology and, like baking. It's like, I don't know. I just thought it was very interesting, and it was nice to like have it as an excuse to like reach out to friends and family and be like, hey, I know you're doing this thing. Like, just send me some videos and we can, go back and forth and make a little video about it.
From stockpiling toiletries to binge-watching new or familiar TV shows, the ways in which we've been coping with the current global pandemic says a lot about our instincts as humans. In times of uncertainty, it's normal to seek out comforts like indulging in a favorite food or by binge-watching a comfort show. But many people are also turning to a more primal activity, baking. Whether it's bread, cookies, or a delicious pan of cinnamon buns, the sense of accomplishment that comes with a successful bake can be a much-needed boost during these uncertain times. A staple in a majority of households, bread is the poster food for comfort and satiety, making it a prime choice for baking. Denise Donnelly, an amateur bread baker in Rockport, Massachusetts, has been baking every week since the start of social isolation.
It was because I wanted to feel as if we had some control over getting our food and not wanting to go to grocery stores and not wanting to buy bread that was not necessarily going to be what we're looking for. I decided to start baking. And so I've made hamburger rolls, brioche rolls every Friday for hamburgers. I make bread several times a week, either this recipe or one using yeast. And it's very satisfying, and it gives me a feeling of some control over our lives.
Even college students who are balancing final projects and job searching are finding comfort in the joys of baking desserts to be enjoyed with family.
So today I'm making lemon poppy seed muffins. They're one of my absolute favorite things to have with coffee, and I was on Facebook the other day and I found a great clean recipe. So they're gluten-free and they're made with Greek yogurt, and they're just pretty much a healthy version of the traditional lemon poppy seed muffins.
I decided to bake today because tomorrow we're going to be dropping off some food to both my grandma and my brother, so I thought it'd be a nice treat to give them some homemade chocolate chip cookies.
Rising for another 20 minutes.
But why does it seem like every single household is participating in this quarantine trend? That's because baking provides a sense of comfort, not just so that we can fill time during isolation. It serves as a reminder that we can take survival into our own hands if need be. For some people, cooking and baking is not simply a survival hobby or way to pass the time, it's a way of life. For chefs, the ample downtime has only heightened the desire to make foods. TJ, a chef at Pineapple and Pearls in Washington, D.C., is using baking and cooking not just to heighten his spirits, but to practice his skills.
So during COVID-19, my restaurant, Pineapple and Pearls, has actually been closed. So for me, I've been cooking and baking at home so much. Just out of almost boredom, but just because I love to cook. So not being able to do it in a professional setting kind of made it come back into my house.
Most people have been following coronavirus updates in the news, leading to a buildup of anxiety and fear in the brain. But the holy grail of grain gives our monkey brains an easily digestible diversion. Eating carbohydrate foods like bread stimulates insulin, which raises the uptake by the brain of the essential amino acid tryptophan, according to Harvey Anderson, a professor of nutritional science at the University of Toronto. Tryptophan in the brain increases production of serotonin, a neurotransmitter that promotes calm and sleep in times of stress. Learning a new skill also elicits feelings of accomplishment and productivity related to personal growth. At times it feels like all of humankind is stuck at a standstill, frozen in time, unable to participate in the activities that give life meaning and connect us with others. Even when this feeling is hard to ignore, at least we can find comfort in the fact that every household is sharing the same experiences, and that bread, once a staple for meals meant to be shared with others that brings families and friends together, is still a staple connected to one another, brought together by the instincts that we all share, the need for purpose in daily life, and the absolute inevitable need to bake our own crispy but chewy, perfectly risen loaf of bread.